In May of 1985, the board of directors of Apple Computer gathered in a conference room in Cupertino, California, and voted to remove its founder from every product he had ever created. The vote was not close. The man who had orchestrated the removal stood at the head of the table and said 11 words that ended everything. Apple is bigger than any one person, including its founder. The founder was 30 years old. He had built the company from a garage with $1,300 and a circuit board. He had taken it public in a single day that created more millionaires than any American company since Ford. He had recruited the man, now reading his obituary, personally. He had flown to New York, sat across a table for one of the most powerful executives in America, and delivered a line so precise it has been repeated in every business school on Earth for 40 years. Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugar water, or do you want a chance to change the world? John Sculley left Pepsi, took the job, and 3 years later, used the exact same logic, vision, persuasion, the future versus the present, to remove the man who had taught it to him. Remember those 11 words. Apple is bigger than any one person, including its founder, because I will come back to them at the end of this video, and by then, they will mean something completely different to you. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how a 30-year-old man built the foundation of the most valuable company in human history and was removed from it before anyone understood what he had actually built. And you're going to understand why the same mechanism destroys every person who sees the future more clearly than the people around them. In 1974, Steve Jobs was 19 years old and had nothing. Not nothing in the way people say when they mean they started with less than average. Nothing in the specific, physical sense. No degree, no savings, no apartment. He had dropped out of Reed College after one semester because his adoptive parents, a machinist and a bookkeeper from Mountain View, California, could no longer afford the tuition. He was sleeping on the floor of a friend's dorm room, eating free meals at the Hare Krishna Temple in Los Altos, and selling his Volkswagen van for parts. What he had, in place of everything else, was a quality that is almost impossible to name without making it sound smaller than it was. An absolute certainty that the world was about to change, and that he could see exactly how. His closest friend was a man named Steve Wozniak. Where Jobs had vision, Wozniak had something rarer in 1974, the ability to build things that had never existed. Wozniak could sit at a workbench for 16 hours and emerge with a circuit board that made trained engineers stop and stare. He designed for the pleasure of designing. He gave his schematics away for free at the Homebrew Computer Club in Menlo Park, because the idea of charging for something he had created purely out of curiosity had not occurred to him. Jobs looked at what Wozniak built and saw something Wozniak could not see himself. He saw who would want it. He saw why. He saw the number they would pay. In 1976, in the garage of Jobs' childhood home on Chris Drive in Los Altos, they built the Apple I. Not a finished product. A circuit board with no case, no keyboard, no screen. Wozniak had designed it because the problem was interesting. Jobs looked at it and immediately understood it was a business. He sold his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sold his HP 65 calculator, the most advanced pocket calculator in the world at the time, worth $500. Together, they had $1,300. On April 1st, 1976, they founded Apple Computer Company. Jobs was 21 years old. Wozniak was 25. Neither of them had any idea what they had started. By December 12, 1980, Apple went public on the NASDAQ at $22 a share. By the end of that single trading day, the stock had closed at $29. Apple's market capitalization was $1.778 billion. Steve Jobs, at 25 years old, held shares worth $256 million. It was the largest technology IPO in American history since Ford Motor Company in 1956. But the number that matters is not $256 million. The number that matters is what happened the year before the IPO. In 1979, when Jobs walked into a research facility in Palo Alto that would change the direction of everything. Xerox Park, the Palo Alto Research Center. the most advanced computer research lab in the world, funded by Xerox and staffed by the best computer scientists of a generation. They had built something they did not know how to sell, a computer with a graphical interface, a screen where you could point at things instead of typing commands, a mouse, windows, icons, a computer that did not require you to learn a language to operate. Xerox had no idea what to do with it. Jobs walked in, saw in a 15-minute demonstration, and understood in 15 minutes what Xerox had failed to understand in 5 years of development. This machine was not for engineers. It was not for corporations. It was for the person who had never touched a computer and never would, unless the computer stopped asking them to become something they were not. Here is what every analyst, every journalist, every business school professor missed about Apple in 1980. They thought Apple was in the computer business. Apple was not in the computer business. Apple was in the identity business. Every machine they built was asking the person holding it one question. Do you see yourself as someone who thinks differently from everyone else? The computer was never the product. The answer to that question was the product. And the only person inside Apple who understood this completely was the person they were about to vote out of the building. This is why the Macintosh was possible. And it is why what happened next was not just a corporate dispute. It was the removal of the only person who knew what the company was actually selling. In 1983, Jobs made the decision that would end him. He needed someone to run the business side of Apple. He was a visionary, not an operator. He knew it. The board knew it. And so Jobs did what he always did. He looked at the problem, identified the best possible solution in the world, and went to get it. John Sculley was the president of PepsiCo. He had engineered the Pepsi Challenge, the blind taste test campaign that had, for the first time in the history of the Cola Wars, put Pepsi ahead of Coca-Cola in consumer preference polls. He understood marketing at a level that few people in American business did. He understood how perception creates reality, how the story you tell about a product determines whether people buy it before they have ever tasted it. Jobs flew to New York, sat across from Sculley in his office overlooking Manhattan, and delivered the line. Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugar water, or do you want a chance to change the world? Sculley took the job. What Jobs did not know, could not have known, because his own greatest quality blinded him to it, is that he had just hired the most dangerous person he would ever meet. Not because Sculley was malicious, because Sculley was brilliant in exactly the way Jobs was not. And in 2 years, that difference would cost Jobs everything. I will show you the exact moment it became inevitable right now. On January 22nd, 1984, Apple aired a 60-second television commercial during the third quarter of Super Bowl 18. It had been directed by Ridley Scott, fresh from Blade Runner. It had cost $900,000 to produce and $500,000 to air. The Apple board had watched a rough cut in December 1983 and voted, almost unanimously, to never show it. They wanted their $900,000 back. They instructed the advertising agency to sell the Super Bowl slot to someone else. Jobs refused. He fought for the ad with the same absolute certainty he brought to every product decision. The agency tried to sell the slot. Failed. The ad aired. A woman in a white dress ran through a gray totalitarian corridor. Rows of shaved head figures watched the screen projecting the face of Big Brother. She threw a sledgehammer. The screen exploded. The tagline appeared. On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. The Macintosh launched 2 days later. In the first 100 days, Apple sold $3.5 million worth of machines. And then the sales slowed. And then they stopped. Jobs had insisted on a retail price of $2,495. In 1984 dollars. His own engineers had told him the machine needed to be $1,000 cheaper to compete. He refused. He had also insisted on a sealed case. No expansion slots, no way for third-party developers to add capabilities. IBM's PC ran software from hundreds of independent companies. The Macintosh ran software only Apple had approved. Corporate buyers, the buyers who moved the kind of volume that sustained a public company, needed machines that could be expanded, integrated, and customized. The Macintosh was beautiful and closed. IBM was functional and open. In an enterprise market, functional beats beautiful every time. By the end of 1984, Apple had missed 2 consecutive quarters of sales projections. The board was meeting without Jobs. Scully was compiling a document. That document described Jobs using 3 words that had been chosen with legal and strategic precision: unmanageable, volatile, unscalable. Not wrong, not failed, unscalable. The argument was not that Jobs had made bad decisions. The argument was that Jobs himself, his personality, his method, his absolute refusal to operate by consensus, was structurally incompatible with a company of Apple's size. The company had outgrown him. That was the argument, and the board believed it. In May 1985, Scully called a board meeting. Jobs was not in the room when the vote was taken. By the time he arrived, it was already done. Scully stood at the head of the table and delivered the 11 words he had prepared. Apple is bigger than any one person, including its founder. The board voted to strip Jobs of all operational responsibilities. He was given a new title, Global Visionary. No budget, no team, no product, no power. A title that had been constructed to look like respect and function as erasure. He was 30 years old. What happened in the hours after the vote is not in any official history. Jobs did not go home. He walked the floors of Apple, the building he had designed the culture of, the corridors where he had personally recruited the engineers now sitting at their desks, trying not to make eye contact. He stopped at each desk. He told them what had happened, not as a speech, as a fact. He did not speak to Scully. He did not address the board. He had nothing to say to the people who had voted. He had everything to say to the people who had believed. He walked toward the exit. At the door, he turned to the last person he passed and said 4 words quietly, not as a threat, not as a declaration, but as a statement of fact he was not certain anyone would still believe in 12 years. I'm the one who built this company. Nobody stopped him. Every person who has ever built something from nothing knows the moment when the thing they built develops interests of its own. When the institution becomes large enough to look back at its creator and say, the version of you that imagined this is no longer the version of you we need. Jobs' flaw was not arrogance. That is the version the board told. His flaw was something more precise and more tragic. He trusted the people he chose because he believed that anyone he had chosen with his level of conviction must have understood what he was building. He had hired Scully because Scully understood perception. He had not considered that a man who understood perception would eventually turn that understanding on him. Vision without political intelligence is not a gift. It is a promissory note you write to the people who will one day redeem it, in your name, without you. The question Jobs never asked. The question every person who has ever built something needs to ask before they bring in someone to help them scale it is this: does the person I am hiring understand what I am building, or do they only understand how to sell it? Those are not the same thing. And confusing them is the most expensive mistake a founder can make. Apple is bigger than any one person, the man Jobs had recruited said. And Jobs walked to the door of the building he had named and said quietly to the last person he passed, I'm the one who built this company. Nobody stopped him. What none of them knew, what Scully would not understand until it was too late, what the board would spend a decade trying to undo, what the business press would get completely wrong for 12 years, is what happens to a man when everything is taken from him and he has nothing left to do but prove what he always knew. In part 2, how Jobs spent 12 years in the wilderness building 2 companies that would reshape entertainment and personal computing. How Apple, without him, lost $1 billion in a single year and came within 90 days of bankruptcy. And what Jobs said to Scully in the room, face to face, on the day he came back. That conversation has never been reported accurately, and it will change the way you see every person who has ever been told they are too much for the thing they created.